today, Madiba K. Dennie is the author of The Originalism Trap and deputy editor and senior contributor at the critical legal commentary website Balls and Strikes. She is also the co-director of the Democracy Committee of the New Jersey Reparations Council and was previously a counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice. Her legal and political commentary has been featured in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and elsewhere. She is taught at Western Washington University and New York University School of Law. Dennie is a graduate of Columbia Law School and Princeton University. Her debut book, The Originalism Trap, How Extremists Stole the Constitution and How We the People Can Take It Back, is now available wherever books are sold. So I think we're all in for a treat today. And with that, is there anything I missed in your resume that you'd like to add?
No, I think those are the highlights.
Right on. All right. Well, I'm just going to pass it off to you. My internet has been kind of like wonky, so I'll probably have my screen off. But like I said, I will keep track of the chat. Okay.
Sounds good.
Have at it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to get to chat with you all. I wanted to start by noting, as you did, the chaos of everything that's been happening. I feel like it would be sort of unrealistic to not acknowledge that. Oh, I'm seeing something saying can't hear. Let me try. Maybe if I sit closer to the microphone, and I'll try project.
I can hear
Other
you just fine,
you
but
can hear me okay? Okay. Um, yeah, I think it's a mix. Some are saying they can, some are saying they can't. Um,
the
okay.
volume is quite low, though. I will say that now that I take because I'm all the way up at 300 or 100%. So it's kind of weird. I'm not really sure why. I don't know
Yeah,
if it's our settings or what.
I'm not sure. Uh, let's see. Are you? Can folks hear me okay? Or at least can you hear me better? If not,
You
fully
know what?
okay.
It's like I said, it's not great, but maybe we could also turn on the closed captionings for this. I know that there's a way
Oh,
to
that's
do
a good
that.
idea.
So at least we can try that.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that, folks. Um, Yeah, I will do my best to project a bit more. Oh, hang on. Actually, I might be able to do something here. Okay, what about now? Did that improve anything or make it worse?
It still sounds the same to me. It's quite quiet.
Okay, okay. Uh, let's see. And what about now?
That
Yay,
is
so much
that
better.
is much better.
Much better?
Yes.
Ah!
Yes.
Okay. Very glad. Thank you. Apologies, folks. Thank you for bearing with me. Yeah, I just had to figure some of that out. um, okay, let's get into it. So I had wanted to start with making references, as you did in the introduction, to the chaos of the past few weeks, because I think there are a couple of things to take from it. One is obviously the stakes are very high. There is a lot of bad that the Trump administration is actively trying to do in curtailing rights for us and our loved ones. But I also think it's important for us to note that the constitutional order is clearly in a state of flux. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. The legal changes that Trump and company are trying to make right now are definitely bad things. That's not in dispute. But I'm saying that these rapid, awful changes show inherently that legal change, even dramatic legal change, is possible. So we don't have to live like this. We can actually decide for ourselves what constitutes legitimate legal thought. And I also think it is an important sort of lesson from this chaos is that the self proclaimed originalists have been dishonest to you. They have not been telling the truth. So, originalism is the idea that the meaning of the Constitution is fixed in time. Originalists say that its meaning is frozen at the moment it was enacted. And so, the only way to understand the Constitution now is however it would have been understood when it was enacted, purportedly understood back then. Um, and the rationale that they present for this is that it introduces objectivity to legal interpretation and provides necessary constraints on judges. If not for the neutral principles of originalism, they say, judges would be free to act based on their own idiosyncratic values, their personal views, and to override the will of the people willy nilly. They say that they alone are committed to understanding what the Constitution actually means by seeking out the single, readily ascertainable historical meaning that theoretically exists. And I think it has become extraordinarily clear. I would argue it was already clear, but it's now become extraordinarily clear that they didn't really mean any of that. So many of the same lawyers that have the same politicians and professors who've been swearing up and down that originalism is the sole legitimate basis for ascertaining constitutional meaning have abandoned that or twisting themselves into originalist pretzels as they try to support Trump's nonsense, such as his executive order on day one in office, uh, purporting to override the 14th Amendment's guarantee of birthright citizenship. And you can't honestly claim to be governed by the Constitution's original public meaning and to prioritize history and tradition above basically everything else, and then breathlessly defend Trump's birthright citizenship order, which courts have found conflicts with the plain language of the 14th Amendment, contradicts the 125-year-old binding Supreme Court precedent, and runs counter to our nation's 250-year history of citizenship by birth. So there's a lot in here of the madness of the past few weeks that sort of emphasizes that the originalist model of interpretation is intellectually and morally bankrupt. But another important lesson is that the way we choose to interpret the Constitution can shape and constrain people's rights, their ability to vindicate them, their access to power, and efforts to build a just society. And I believe we can and should do better. So, inherently, by tying our constitutional principles, at least in theory, when convenient for them, to whenever their preferred founding father walked the earth, uh, the originalist ideology glorifies an era of blatant oppression along racial, gender, and class lines. And by design, this tends to transform that era's lowest shortcomings into our highest standards. And we've seen this play out in some egregious landmark rulings, some which helped really motivate me to write the book in the first place. I think the sort of tipping point for me was when the Dobbs draft was leaked, and seeing Alito lay out on behalf of the court, basically trying to say, well, women didn't used to have rights then, so they can't have rights now. So anyone who is pregnant, like the state can regulate that as they wish. And we also saw originalist type rationale used in Bruin, which was the case that dramatically expanded gun rights, saying that gun regulations now are presumptively unconstitutional unless you can point to a historical analog that Clarence Thomas thinks is sufficiently similar. Uh, so we have seen a lot of awful things, really, that can come out of applying this originalist standard. And that's the point of it. But I would also want to raise that some have suggested that maybe it doesn't have to be. There's a more leftish liberal view that takes issue with standard originalism's sloppy historiography and originalism's sudden loss of interest in their preferred interpretive method as soon as it comes to the post Civil War amendments, which dramatically expanded the political community. So some liberals recommend that we refine originalism, try focus on the Reconstruction era and do the history right. By the Reconstruction era, I'm referring to that time in the aftermath of the Civil War where the government worked quite literally to reconstruct the nation and redefine citizenship rights for the whole country as they were trying to address the status of the formerly enslaved Black people. There's a good question here. What does originalism mean in the context of the amendments? That is a great question, and one that is subject to debate. In the Bruin opinion I mentioned, that really just upended the way gun jurisprudence works. Clarence Thomas, he wrote the majority opinion, was very unclear. He said, he's like, okay, well, the Second Amendment was written at this time, but also the Second Amendment only applied to the states through the 14th Amendment later. The original amendments to the Constitution, like the first 10, just applied to the federal government. And it was through the 14th Amendment that we then use that to apply, make sure everything applied to the states as well. And so Thomas was like, all right, it's either when the Second Amendment was written or perhaps when the 14th Amendment was written, but I don't need to decide that right now. He like literally says we don't need to decide that to answer this question, which sort of hints at the real methodology is picking and choosing what works for the result that they want. Um, and there's a lot of that in Bruin. He does it's kind of like a Goldilocks type of process. He's like, this time in history, it doesn't count because it was too early. This time doesn't count because it was too late. This was actually at the right time, but it was an outlier, not representative of the historical period. And so he just carves everything up until all that's left is the history that supports what he wanted to do. So because there is this sort of competing history, that's why some folks who disagree with the sort of like reactionary far right type of originalism we're seeing is like, well, hang on a second. Can we zoom out a bit to other voices at that time? Like you're just taking a very narrow slice of history. Can we look at other people at that time? Are we listening to only Johnny Slaveholder in 1865? Or are we considering the views of enslaved people, of indentured servants, of indigenous people? Like who all, even if you're thinking still at that time, who all's view gets to count? Are you just sort of privileging the view of the wealthy white guys who were able to write everything down and dictate what went into those history books? Um, so that's why some on the left are saying, we have other history available to us, especially the Reconstruction history, which was a really pivotal point for this country as it really just transformed the Constitution into a document that was primarily concerned about those sort of federal state relationships, like between the federal government and the state governments, to something that became more concerned with relationships between the government and the people and the ability to protect individuals' rights, to be able to defend the rights of marginalized people, and even push for more. We get those through the Reconstruction Amendments. Um, but with that said, and I have a lot of love for the Reconstruction Amendments, which will happily elaborate on a bit later, I think it's actually a strategic and intellectual mistake to try do like originalism but make it woke. Um, as a strategic matter, I think originalism for liberals is still just legitimizing originalism because it's conceding the premise that the Constitution's meaning was set in stone 200 odd years ago. Uh, I don't think that's what we should do. I think that we all have our sort of democratic inheritance to continue thinking about what the Constitution means to us today. Also, if we are, frozen at that time, 200 and change years ago, it's just going to become, totally inapplicable to today's problems. It's like having one arm tied behind your back. Um, and furthermore, I think embracing originalism clearly, as demonstrated with Clarence Thomas's magical mystery tour through history to get to the parts he liked, embracing originalism won't actually persuade conservatives because they didn't really care about the sort of process like they said in the first place. In order for progressive originalism to work in front of an originalist court, originalists must be willing to follow history wherever it leads, even if doing so produces a progressive result. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly shown that it utilizes originalism, excuse me, utilizes originalism selectively in order to achieve their policy goals. Um, so that's the same sort of intellectual and strategic type flaw. Like they One of the another issue that progressive originalism replicates from original recipe originalism is that they're making constitutional interpretation dependent on an era that was hostile to most Americans. They are not going to convince people, and even though the Reconstruction amendments uh, were and remain like really powerful tools for marginalized people, to the extent an objective public meaning at the time of ratification can even be discovered. I would contest that it can, but even if we were to say that we can, the original meaning of the 14th Amendment would be a poor substitute to the way we understand it today. And I'll give us an example. That patron saint of originalism, Justice Antonin Scalia, argued in 2011 that the 14th Amendment does not prohibit sex discrimination. He dismissively said, nobody ever thought that's what it meant. So it's a good thing then that our understanding of the 14th Amendment has become more inclusive over time, protecting people across more axes of discrimination. So I think we should view the Reconstruction Amendments as an invaluable foundation, but also only a foundation that it is up to us to build upon. Um, let's see,
I
why?
just I feel like this is more of a like a rhetorical question,
Mhm.
but truly, why would the amendment process be included in the Constitution if the founders had intended for there to be only what's originally in it? And that like it's a rhetorical question, but also like what are
How do
their
they
arguments
reconcile
that they
this?
use to justify it?
Yeah. So what originalists would say is that that is the legitimate way of changing constitutional interpretation. They would be like, well, you don't we can't have judges just sort of doing what they want willy-nilly. If you want to alter the Constitution, that's what the amendment process is for. So then you can just formally go through all of those hurdles, and now you have that. So it's saying that there can be change, but then that amendment too would be frozen at the time that it was enacted. So it leaves some wiggle room. Like they can try grapple with the idea of like, yes, it can change, but it can only change in this way. Um, let's see something else. I'm just looking at the questions here on the side. Uh, yeah, how originalism would affect Griswold. Uh, so should we all be footnote 4 fans? That one's for the nerds. This is a deep cut, so I'll explain what that means for folks who are not like legal nerds. Footnote 4 refers to a footnote in a case, a long, very old Supreme Court case about a product of yesteryear called filled milk, Caroline products. And in a tucked away in a footnote of that case, as they were talking about what the appropriate standard of review was, which is like a fancy way of saying like how hard should judges be looking at what the legislators were doing? Like, does this seem like it's okay? And so we don't need to look at it that hard. It's just like a sort of like normal basic level, like just economic type regulation? Or does it seem like there's something suspicious happening here? Like there's some sort of like targeting happening of a group? So what footnote 4 says is, if they're, if we need to like protect the rights of like discrete and insular minorities, uh then like we should judges should be able to look at that a little more intensely. That was sort of the origin story of the tiers of scrutiny. So like strict scrutiny is something you might have heard, because there's like a popular podcast with that name now. So that's where that comes from, saying it's basically the court saying we should be able to take a hard look when it seems like there's some funny business going on, that is harmful to marginalized communities. Um, let's see. So, do we need to test judges on their understanding of how time works? Yeah, this is something that judges have been struggling with. I was really riding a high. I'm still riding a high today, because this morning I saw that one of my articles about how uh, originalism really just is not workable, uh, was cited in a district court, federal district court opinion, because I was looking at some of the recent cases in lower courts trying to apply the Supreme Court's Bruin new gun standard, and they don't know at all how to do it. They're saying, like, what part of time should I be looking at? Like, when in history? Like, Clarence didn't specify. Like, is this time okay? Is that time okay? What about like this type of law? And the Supreme Court has tried to make it a little more clear, in a more recent case, a case called Rahimi. The court said that they were, re-articulating what they said before. They're like, for some reason, lower courts didn't understand us, but this is what we said. And it didn't make anything clearer because originalism is sort of like inherently muddy, as people are just trying to, yeah, they're trying to pick which piece of history, and there's no real consistent way to do it. And so I was really entertained seeing a judge cite that piece in an opinion, saying, "Yeah, I don't know what to do." So I found that really entertaining. Um, let's see. I missed a question here, or something about
I got it
response.
for you.
You got it. Okay.
It's from Mark, and he says in the U.S. House of Representatives, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert claim that the United States is a Christian nation, and only Christians can vote and hold elected offices in the USA, which is their ultimate goal. How close are they, do you think, to getting what they want?
I don't think I knew the only Christians can vote and hold office part. I've definitely heard the Christian nation type statements, but only Christians can vote is that's horrifying.
Much,
That's
yeah. Though it does make me think of another um bill, I guess, that's going through making its way through. I think it's the Save Act, and it's about limiting, what, how, how could that possibly, like, if my birth certificate name does not match my married name, if I took on like, how constitutionally could that be upheld?
right, yeah. So I think there are strong constitutional arguments against it. I can say that this is like an equal protection violation, saying, there's like a whole class of people, predominantly women, who change their names upon marriage, and this is like establishing like this really like difficult burden on a fundamental right. So I think there is a legitimate constitutional challenge there. One also could argue that there's an equal rights amendment challenge there, since like Biden on his way out said, like, by the way, I recognize the equal rights amendment. Bye. uh, which was an interesting way to do it. But this comes back a bit to what I was saying at the top of the hour, though, about how the constitutional order is clearly in flux and like things are shifting. So I think what would be really interesting is, oh, I see something saying he didn't order the publishing of the ERA. That's not actually a constitutional requirement. So it is a, yeah, it's been like a sort of political point. Actually, hang on. I'm going to take a step back because I love this and I'm getting ahead of myself. And so I want to make sure everything is clear and make sure that I state the point I want to make in a way everyone can get. Um, Not only is the constitutional order in a state of flux, the way the Constitution has been amended over time has often been kind of wacky. The Equal Rights Amendment is not at all the First Amendment to have like questionable legitimacy in terms of like how it actually becomes an amendment. We have seen, but again, before the Equal Rights Amendment, states ratify an amendment and then say, never mind, we take it back and try undo it. We've had only, yeah, the First Amendment affirms we're not a Christian nation, yeah, which is like what y'all's organization, if I'm understanding it correctly, is all about, like secular AZs, like trying to keep church and state separate. Um, but yeah, so it is there's a really like a lot of interesting uh strange often ways that the constitution has been amended over time that often does not actually uh follow the strict terms laid out in article 5 of the constitution, which is what spells out the amendment process. So we have this amendment process, but the Constitution has been amended without actually using that on multiple occasions, um, which I think is really interesting and sort of gets to the point that about the Equal Rights Amendment and like whether it's real law, like whether it's really part of the Constitution, is that it's not so much a constitutional question as it is a political question. It's like a question of people's will and whether they will fight for it and whether they're like willing to advocate for it, because that's actually how change often happens. And folks, there was some discussion about the Second Amendment in the chat earlier. I think I saw someone mention the like militia. So the because if you read the plain language of the Second Amendment, it is very clear about a well-regulated militia. Like that's what the right to a gun is explicitly tied to. But that has been all but written out over the past 20-ish years, maybe actually even shorter than that. But shorter than that, and that for when the court actually recognized that and said as much. But a little longer in terms of the political and cultural shift. Like right wing actors and like the NRA wanted there to be an individual right to a handgun. There wasn't an individual right to a handgun, but they wanted it and they said there was, and they pushed for it. And so by 2008 or so, you, for the first time, get the Supreme Court declaring that there is an individual right to a handgun. Actually, I'm gonna pull up a quote for you. I hope I can find it back promptly because I was very amused by it. Uh, yes, okay, here it is. I was like, I know I mentioned this in the book, so I just pulled up my PDF of my book and did a Control F real quick. um, so uh, saying the idea that the Second Amendment, I'm just going to read this small little passage. The idea that the Second Amendment protects individual gun ownership is a modern invention that former Chief Justice Warren Burger, a Republican appointed by President Richard Nixon, so not like your bleeding heart liberal type, he described this idea in 1991 as, quote, one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime. That's a Republican saying that in 1991, who's like looking at this sort of evolution of folks saying that there's an individual right to a handgun, and he's looking around like, this is wild. What are y'all doing? um, and yeah, especially as it's tied to this, silly ahistorical notion that it's what it always meant, which is what originalists say. Like they claim that this is what it means today, and it's always meant this. So this is part of why I advocate for accepting that constitutional meaning changes, acknowledging that, and then thinking about how it should change. I think that that's been one of the shortcomings in like left of center constitutional interpretation for a while, is that it is acknowledged freely that constitutional meaning shifts. This idea is frequently referred to as the living constitution, whereas originalists like to say the constitution is dead. Uh, and so they say there's a living constitution, but conservatives and like originalist types sort of like latch on to that with grave concern, saying, well, if you're saying there's a living constitution, that means that it can mean anything. It means that it can change in any which a way. Who knows for what it can change, for better or worse. Um, so I think that a shortcoming on the left that I try to address with my book is, the living constitution idea is more descriptive than prescriptive. It acknowledges that constitutional meaning changes, but it does not tell you how constitutional meaning should change. So I was trying to say, here's how it should change. And I think that the Constitution actually tells us how it should change. So it's not as if we're just sort of plucking something out of thin air, as originalists claim. We have guidance for us, right here in the document itself, in the form of the Reconstruction Amendments. So I'm not suggesting that we should, interpret the Reconstruction Amendments the way they were then, but I think that the idea of the Reconstruction Amendments, the directive that they gave Congress, and the directive that Congress gave, and the all sort of obligation on the federal government to protect the rights of marginalized people, to expand the political community, to fight for an egalitarian society. These are really inclusive, powerful goals that are embodied within the Reconstruction Amendments. These are the amendments that constitutionalize the abolition of slavery, with the regrettable exception as punishment for a crime. It established like equal protection under law, the grant of due process under law, birthright citizenship, as I mentioned. Um, it prohibited insurrectionists from taking office again. That was in there for what it's worth. And a whole heap of other stuff, honestly. The 14th Amendment is very expansive. And like the 15th Amendment, formally prohibited in the Constitution racial discrimination in voting and political participation. So through this set of these three amendments, we got for the first time a constitutional renunciation of the higher racial and economic and like various assorted other bigotries and hierarchies that the country had existed for basically the whole time the country existed. Uh, and so we actually got the Constitution to reject that. And it was, oh, I just remembered, and one of the many things that the 14th Amendment does, and the 15th as well, in addition to establishing these guarantees, it authorizes Congress to like enact new legislation to fulfill those things. So I see this as very much like an affirmative instruction. Like we are being told to do something. It's like the exact opposite of originalism saying we have to freeze everything in place. The Constitution itself is actually telling us we need to be changing things. We need to be ridding ourselves of injustice. We need to be building an equitable, multiracial democracy that works for all of us, in which we can all live and function freely and fairly as political and like civil and equals. So I think that's the lesson to take from the Reconstruction Amendments. And I think and it's not just limited to, just those three amendments. I think that this is a frame through which we should view the whole Constitution. It's like it puts everything that came before it in a whole new light. So I call this inclusive constitutionalism. So I'm saying, because the purpose of the Constitution is to facilitate the actual functioning of an inclusive multiracial democracy. And so, whenever we're interpreting any part of the Constitution, we should be doing so with those ideas in mind of how do I make democracy real? How do I actually build an egalitarian society? Like how do I end hierarchies that are permeating through society and like keeping people from living freely? So this is why, yeah, I call this inclusive constitutionalism, and I introduced this idea in the book as sort of like laying out what it means, how it could apply in different situations, and how people could try to fight for it. Uh,
There was
that's
one question that I wanted to get
Yeah.
to that comes from Jude. She's saying, what are your thoughts about states now calling for an Article 5 constitutional convention? Parentheses, AZ claims it's to enact federal term limits, but dot, dot, dot.
Yeah, yeah. Um, it makes me nervous, to be quite honest, because I do support amending the Constitution. I think there are a lot of things that can and should be changed about the Constitution, but there is not at all agreement right now on what those things are. And or to the extent there is agreement, there's like agreement between folks who I very much don't agree with, who are trying to rally together to be like, all right, like let's get in there and change the Constitution to make like a balanced budget amendment, or to get rid of birthright citizenship, or just like all sorts of terrible nonsense. And so and also the other thing is that a constitutional convention under Article 5 has never actually happened before. So there's no real model as for what it should be. And my sort of concern about that is that then yeah, exactly, no rules, saying that like anything can happen, and there's not yet like a sort of agreed upon standard to be like, no, you can't do it like that, or no, you can't do that. So I think the Constitutional Convention is, at least right now, a whole can of worms, because I think you truly have no idea what you're going to get out of it. It is possible that you could try set it up in a way to be like, all right, we are holding a constitutional convention only to talk about this thing, to try cabinet. However, the original draft of the Constitution emerged in a very similar fashion. They were sent into a room to remedy the Articles of Confederation. They were only supposed to be making a few small changes, and then they came out like, so actually we wrote a new constitution. They weren't supposed to do that, but it was what they did. And I feel like I can imagine something similar happening with a constitutional convention, except for right now, I don't think we'll be coming out of it with something like, the Bill of Rights. I think we'll be coming out of it with something, like demonizing people of color, just taking away all sort of reproductive autonomy, and just all manner of terrible stuff, as I said. So that is why I am a bit wary at present of a constitutional convention. I think I would prefer that folks go the like amendment route, as messy as it is, because I think that we can keep a handle on that a bit better. Whereas I think I am nervous about what would happen with the constitutional convention, and I don't share that same sort of like nervousness for like the sort of normal amendment process that has been used a few dozen times. Is the three-quarter states for an amendment bar too high? Yeah. I think three-quarters of the country looked very different in like the 1800s than it does now. Like the country was a much smaller place. And so like this is just a ton. Like it's asking for a lot more. And I think in some ways, because of that really like high bar, in terms of you need this like super majority of states, you need like all of these the super majority in Congress. So if we and we have all this gridlock in Congress as it is, so basically what you end up with is an kind of functionally unamendable, formally unamendable constitution. So that would mean that the only other way to amend the Constitution would be by changing interpretation. I think of interpretive shifts as sort of informal amendments, kind of. Um, but when we have originalism instead, we're being told that we can't change the Constitution because of originalism, and also we can't change the Constitution because it's just like too impractical. So then you're just stuck, and that is a disservice in a democratic society. Like that just doesn't work. Um, there needs to it's unsustainable, and it doesn't allow a a diverse society to be able to function well. We need to be able to respond to our shifting conditions, respond to our needs, be able to push for different understandings of rights as our understandings change, and embody that in the Constitution. That's why I think that originalism uh, sort of amplifies the danger that's already posed by the really high amendment bar. Um, Now, with that said, I did mention that sometimes the amendment process is strange. So it I can imagine a world where like the like technical requirements for an amendment are not actually met, but if enough people still fight for it and push for it, and basically act as if it's real, then it sort of just gradually becomes accepted. I think that it's people's power to change constitutional meaning is woefully underestimated. Uh, I do not think that judges are the only ones who get to say what the Constitution means. Neither are our electeds. The people always have the final say. It always comes back to whether or not people will accept it, and people can also demand shifts in what the Constitution means. Now, sometimes we've seen that in ways that I imagine most people on this call probably won't approve of, like the individual right to a handgun. But we've also seen this in really good ways, like ending segregation and like decriminalizing same-sex relationships. Um, I like to point to those latter two in particular, and I lay this out a bit towards the end of the book as well, explaining that the actual the actual text of the Constitution formally it wasn't amended. At least there were no relevant amendments. I think maybe by the time we're talking about gay marriage, I think there was like maybe an amendment about like Congress's pay, so like irrelevant to this. um, but there were no relevant constitutional amendments. The words on the four corners of the page like didn't change in any meaningful sense between the court saying there is no constitutional problem with state mandated racial segregation, and saying actually state mandated racial segregation is unconstitutional. There was not a change in the Constitution. What changed in that time was people demanding the Constitution be read differently. So people changed. And the same is true of when you look at the LGBTQ rights movement. Uh, it's a 29-year period, I think, between three Supreme Court cases. There was one that said, and it was like in 87-ish or so, that said there was no problem with making it a crime for like people of the same sex to have sex consensually, privately, like in their home. That you could criminalize that. The Supreme Court said that was a-okay in like the late 80s, I think it was. Um, and jump to 2003 or so, the Supreme Court backed away from that. The Supreme Court said, actually, it's unconstitutional to make that a crime. You can't make that a crime. And then jump again to 2015. And that's when we get Obergefell, where the court actually recognizes that same-sex couples have the same constitutional right and freedom to marry as heterosexual couples do. That was all in the course of like under 30 years, where we went from the court saying, you know, gay intimacy is a crime. Gay intimacy cannot be a crime to gay people must be allowed to be married. And that wasn't formal constitutional change. That was just people power and advocacy. So I think it's really important for folks to remember that and to basically try to enact our own constitutional vision instead, to try like build that inclusive constitutionalist future, because it's not set in stone, like originalism would have us believe. We know that's empirically, demonstrably false. We see it change all the time, and so why shouldn't we change it?
Well, this is what people need to hear today because Stephen just said this is good medicine for me right now. Diane, who's our legal director, says that this is why people have the power today and we have to use it every day. I don't know if this is a question, but James says, I don't understand the logic of overturning Roe. I don't either, but I don't know if that's a question.
I mean,
Um,
I can share a bit of it if you want, because it was you know, try to use originalist reasoning. And again, I'm like, this is just such a silly way to do law. Justice Alito basically went and like counted up the number of laws in like various like colonies and like early states, and was like, well, abortion was a crime in these states at this time, so clearly people thought it could be a crime back then, and so it can be a crime now. Because if you once you know, based on our history and tradition, there's no yeah, we do not have a deeply rooted historical tradition of people having a right to end their pregnancies. And yeah, which is false. Uh, for starters, like, first of all, that's not true. Second of all, even if it was true, so what? Like, we should not, you know, be bound to historical inequities. But one of the multiple wild things about that opinion is that there were actual historians submitting amicus briefs, like speaking out saying, hey, like, you're not actually understanding that history correctly, like here are all these other laws that you're missing, or hey, like there's crucial context you're not getting, and that yeah, abortion was a crime there, but it was a crime like if the doctor like injured the pregnant person. It wasn't actually about ending the pregnancy itself. It was like if they were prescribed like a poison, basically. Saying, or yeah, there was abortion was criminalized at this time, but it was because there was this growing backlash to like the influx of immigrants, and in much the similar ways we saw as we currently see like white supremacist patriarchal types getting real concerned about, you know, white women need to have more babies so we can like remain the master race. So it was the same kind of thing happening back then when folks were shook about like early immigrants, and so we start seeing these laws start getting more common. And Alito just ignores all of that history. He ignores that people have literally always had abortions and always will. Just ignores all of that. Um, and so it's truly exposes like how much they don't actually care about the history, and there's none of this sort of intellectual rigor that they've been pretending to have. One of the, to me, most wild things is that the Dobbs abortion decision and the Bruin guns decision were decided on consecutive days, but with the exact opposite type of originalist reasoning. Uh, in um, in Bruin, the court said if there is no historical law like this, if the state didn't pass any law like this, like regulating guns, it's because it knew it couldn't. It's because they knew it was unconstitutional, so they didn't do it. And that's why if there's like no historical analog, it's your law is probably unconstitutional too. Um, but then in Dobbs, the court said literally the exact opposite thing. The court goes, well, okay, yeah, sure, not abortion wasn't actually a crime everywhere, but just because they didn't make it a crime doesn't mean they thought they couldn't. And it's like, well, which one is it? You said one thing today and one thing yesterday. They use the absence of legislation to make directly conflicting inferences. So this again, just really proving the point that originalism is not about a neutral, objective method of constitutional interpretation. It is about providing a way for reactionary judges to try literally turn back time to like a time when people were worse off as they see fit. They can pick their preferred time period and claw us back through history, and basically try act as if all of the like civil rights gains and like women's rights gains, labor rights gains, so on and so forth, acting as if all of that is presumptively unconstitutional. It says that that every one of us who had to fight for our rights calls our rights into question. Um, so it's a really sort of bizarre logic undergirding Roe. Oh, that's very kind of you, Kathleen. I just saw that comment. Um, yeah, it's a very sort of absurd, tortured logic. But it can make more sense once you take a step back and realize it's just a means to an end. And so, if it is acceptable to think about the ends, let's think about some good ends. Like let's think about like what we actually want to achieve, like building a better democracy, and how our constitutional interpretation can help that instead of hinder that. We've seen a lot of hindrance, but I think that it is possible for us to see help. That we have at least some of the tools already within the Constitution, and so we should use like this like inclusive constitutionalist arguments to push for more and change how we understand the document, because we don't need to understand it the way uh, the 6 Republicans on the court are telling us to.
Yeah, and I love what you said too about, we have the capacity to envision our own ends. And somebody earlier on in the chat asked if any, because there's a few people here who do coalition work and different nonprofits that I'm seeing here on the chat. And so she was, asking, are any orgs putting together our answer to Project 2025 with a Project 2028 or 29, right? Like, and I think that, like we've even had the discussion with our organization about how, while the issues that we focus on are really important, it's probably a discussion organizationally that we haven't revisited, in, maybe over a decade. And so maybe it's
Mhm.
time to really think about the intersectionality of these issues and how they are all so deeply connected. And the other side is running like a well-oiled machine, and we are not. So
Yeah. I think I think that the conservative legal movement uh long recognized the importance of the courts, but more so than that, long recognized the importance of long-term planning. I think that folks left of center maybe even gotten a little too comfortable with some of the court wins, that because we did get some wins over the years, and think that we didn't have to protect them, I guess. Whereas the far right, they were like, we are unsatisfied with what we're seeing here, and we're going to chart out a way to change it. We're going to make like a 50-year plan to just like revolutionize, or I guess counter revolutionize would be more accurate. How, yeah, like how law and society is structured. I'm going to. I'm gonna put y'all onto something. It's you're gonna find it very frustrating. You should Google the Lewis Powell memo. This was a memoranda that was written by Lewis Powell decades ago. It was in the 70s, I think. Basically saying, we think there's an attack happening right now against capitalism, and against our traditional understanding of rights, and too much power being basically too much power being shared with people not like them. And we need to figure out how to fix that. I think the courts are a really good way to do it. And that man was tapped to be on the Supreme Court about 3 months later. It's wild. And but yeah, they just sort of like began charting out how they would go about this. I think another really important actor is Edwin Meese, who ran the Justice Department under Ronald Reagan. They basically turned DOJ into like an originalist think tank, and just like actively decided, we are going to change the way people think about the Constitution. We are going to take this kind of stance in our cases in order to achieve this kind of results. And I don't think we've seen folks do that to the same extent at all on the left, which is deeply distressing. We need to be thinking ahead and thinking strategically about, like, what is it that we want to accomplish and how do we get there? So that's, again, I'm like, this is again part of what I'm trying to do, is sort of like establish like, here's where we should be going. And I throw out in the book, I'm like, here are a few ways to help us get there. I do not claim or pretend to have all the answers or know all the ways. I imagine that there are some ways that we no, I'm sorry to tell you, Mark, that Edwin Meese is alive. I I I relearn this every so often as I look through Supreme Court briefs. I'm like reading like amicus briefs that groups have submitted in a case, and I'm going through, and then I get to one, and I'm like, Edwin Meese. I'm like, he's still submitting briefs? Like, what on earth? I'm like, how is this man still here and still ruining lives? So,
yeah,
um,
it's hilarious.
yeah, constant surprise. Um, but yes, this is, I got a little distracted, but all of this is to say that there's been a dedicated plan by folks on the right throughout time. Like we saw that with the memo, we've seen that in like other sort of plans the right put forth. We saw that in what was called the Declaration of Constitutional Principles, which you might know better from if you learned in grade school about the Southern Manifesto. There's always been this sort of like planned approaches and statements that the left has yet to really replicate. So I think it is critically important for the folks who care about Mises 93. It's really important for those of us who care about things like a more equitable society and like a just world to think about how we can shift our legal and political structures to get there. And yeah, just sort of nailing down, yeah, where it is we want to go and how we're going to get there.
Right on. Normally I ask people at the end of the discussion to tell us what gives you hope, but honestly, like I think that you've given us a lot of hope. But still, I want to keep it open to you. Like, and I feel like you've summarized what gives you hope, and but I don't want to take words out of your mouth either.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned or like at least alluded to some of this, but I think past wins gave me a lot of hope. Seeing what folks have accomplished, even in darker times than these, honestly. Like I know things are dark right now, but I think about enslaved people, and I'm like, if they were still fighting for their freedom, they were still running away, they were still uh, declaring that the Constitution should protect them as well. I'm not just saying that. Like that's literally true. It's an epigraph at the beginning of my book. Is this great part of a great speech from Frederick Douglass. Who is saying that like we the people like means we the people, it means all of us and the Constitution like should work for all of us. And so I think if they were audacious enough to do that even back then I have no excuse not to be. I know that change is possible because things have changed before and this multiple times throughout history, so we can do it too.
Man, that is exactly how we needed to close out our Rage Friday. Honestly, I feel more positively enraged and ready to take things on. So thank you so much. And I got to tell you, Madiba, the chat has just been nothing but praise and really gratitude. So, and suggestions that maybe for our secular summit, which is one of our annual things, and our day at the Capitol, which maybe we could maybe we could see you in person next year.
That could be cool. That sounds
Yeah.
fun.
All right. Well, thanks everybody so much for joining us today. And again, thank you so much, Madiba Dennie, for joining us as well. Again, not only did you drop knowledge, but you dropped a lot of hope on us today, and we really, really need that. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a delight.
Have a great day, everybody. Take care.